I've always been a calm guy, never easily scared. But that night, alone at home, something happened that changed my perception of what is truly frightening. It was a Friday, and I was exhausted after a long week of hard work. I decided to stay home, watch a movie, and go to bed early. The silence in the house was comforting, and the solitude gave me a sense of peace. Around 11 p.m., I went to bed. My room was dark, except for the soft light from the lamp beside the bed. I've always liked sleeping with a small light on. It made me feel safer, especially in such a big house. I closed my eyes, trying to relax and let sleep take over. But that night, sleep was different. I woke up suddenly, not knowing how much time had passed. The first thing I noticed was that I couldn't move. My mind was clear, but my body felt stuck, as if glued to the bed. I tried lifting my arms, moving my legs, but nothing responded. My heart started racing. Suddenly, I felt a presence in the room. I can't explain how, but it was like the air had become heavier, almost suffocating. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow in the corner of the room, near the door. My heart raced even more. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was completely paralyzed, unable to react, while the shadow seemed to slowly move toward me. The shadow took shape. It was a tall, thin figure, almost skeletal. But the most terrifying thing was the face, or the lack of one. Where a face should have been, there was only emptiness, a darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure moved slowly and fluidly, as if gliding across the floor, getting closer and closer. As it approached, I began to hear strange sounds. It was like multiple voices whispering at once, but in a language I didn't understand. The voices came from all around, filling the room with a sinister cacophony. The faceless figure stopped beside my bed, and I could feel the cold emanating from it, like a freezing wind in the middle of winter. My chest felt heavy, as if something was pressing down on it. I struggled to breathe, each breath an effort, struggling to scream, struggling to move, but all my efforts were in vain. I remained frozen in bed. The voices grew louder, almost deafening, and the figure leaned over me. I could feel its presence, a chilling emptiness that seemed to pull at my very consciousness. I desperately wanted to move, scream, do anything to escape the situation. The faceless figure extended a long, bony hand toward my face. I could feel the ice in the air, the touch drawing closer. As the hand was about to touch my forehead, the world seemed to stop. The voices intensified, turning into a high-pitched scream, and the pressure on my chest became unbearable. I felt a wave of pure panic, as if I were on the brink of something terrible and unknown. Then suddenly, everything stopped. The voices ceased, the pressure vanished, and the figure disappeared. I could move again. I sat up in bed, gasping for air, my heart racing. I looked around the room, which was dark and quiet, except for the soft light of the lamp. Everything seemed normal, but I knew what had just happened wasn't a dream. I spent the rest of the night awake, with all the lights on. I couldn't go back to sleep, afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes again. The next morning, I was still in shock. What was that figure? What did those voices mean? I tried to find rational explanations, but nothing made sense. It was as if something from another world had invaded my reality, leaving a mark that would never fade. Since that night, I'm afraid to sleep. The house, which once felt like a refuge, now seems full of shadows and secrets, and the feeling of being watched has never left me. Whenever I'm alone, I feel like that faceless figure is near, just waiting for the right moment to return. That experience made me question everything I thought about the supernatural. Sometimes, reality can be more terrifying than any nightmare, and the sense of helplessness I felt that night is something I'll never forget. Now, every time I feel sleep coming, I fear being trapped again, alone, with that sinister presence and the whispers I could never understand. I don't know why I still like motorcycles. I've always been fascinated by them since I was very young when my uncles and I would always ride around like the guys in a biker club. But after the accident, I should have learned my lesson. but I've always loved the feeling of freedom and adrenaline. That night, I was just taking a ride, enjoying the wind on my face and the sensation of total freedom when everything went wrong. A poorly calculated turn, skidding tires, and there I was, lying on the road, pain all over my body. I was taken to the hospital, and luckily, I only fractured my leg and had some cuts and bruises, nothing too serious. Being admitted to the hospital is never a pleasant experience. The hours pass slowly, and the boredom is almost unbearable. But worse than the boredom is the silence, especially at night. On the third night after the accident, I was placed in a private room, which I thought was great at first. No noisy roommates, no nurses coming in all the time. Just me, my broken leg, and the distant sounds of the hospital. I remember the clock showing a little after 2 in the morning when I woke up. It was dark, with only the faint light from the hallway illuminating the slightly open door of the room. I tried to move, but a sharp pain in my leg reminded me of the accident. As I tried to adjust in bed, I realized I couldn't move anything except my head. My arms and legs felt heavy, as if they were glued to the bed. It was a bizarre feeling, as if my body was asleep, but my mind was completely awake. That's when I saw the figure. In the corner of the room, near the door, a shadow seemed to be moving. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me. I blinked a few times, trying to focus, but the shadow was still there, and it was growing. My heart started to beat faster, and a sense of dread took over me, causing the machines connected to my body to start beeping. The shadow took form. It was a tall, thin, humanoid figure, but strange. It had no defined features, just a dark silhouette. I was paralyzed, not by choice, but by the inability to move any part of my body. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. The figure began to approach, gliding across the floor without making a sound. The figure stopped beside my bed. It was so close I could feel a strange coldness emanating from it. Suddenly, I felt a weight on my chest, as if something invisible was pressing down on me. My breathing became difficult, shorter with each breath. I stared into what should have been the figure's face, but there was nothing there, just an empty void. Then, the thing leaned in. I could feel a suffocating presence, as if the air around me was being drained. My eyes were fixed on that void, and a deep sense of despair took over me. It felt like all the energy was being sucked out of my body. I tried to move, scream, anything, but I was completely trapped, powerless. Suddenly, I heard voices. They were low whispers, indistinct, coming from all directions. It felt like the entire room was whispering, but the words didn't make sense. The figure extended a long, thin hand toward my face, and the pressure on my chest intensified. The feeling was unbearable, like I was about to be crushed. When the hand was about to touch my face, something changed. The hallway lights flickered, and the figure stopped. The voices grew louder for a moment, and then everything went silent. The pressure on my chest eased, and I felt like time had stopped. The figure slowly retreated, as if it were being pulled back by some invisible force. Suddenly, I could move again. I took a deep breath, the air painfully filling my lungs. I looked around the room, which was empty except for my own presence. The figure had disappeared, and the voices were gone. I was alone, lying in bed, with my heart racing and a feeling of terror I had never felt before. I spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what had happened. When the sun began to rise, I felt an indescribable relief. The daylight seemed to banish the darkness that had invaded my room during the night. Nurses came in for their morning rounds, and the hospital returned to its normal routine. I didn't tell anyone what happened. How could I explain something like that? I just said I had a bad nightmare, which was true to some extent, but I knew it wasn't just a nightmare. That figure, that presence, it was something beyond comprehension. Since then, I've tried not to think about it too much, but every time I'm alone in a quiet place, especially at night, I feel a slight anxiety, an irrational fear that it could happen again. Today, as I write this, I'm still trying to process the experience. I don't know if it was just a hallucination induced by the trauma of the accident, or if there really was something there, something I can't explain. What I do know is that night, I felt vulnerable and terrified like never before. And that feeling, that memory, is something I carry with me, a dark reminder that sometimes fear is much more real than we like to admit. I never imagined that a simple night's sleep could turn into the worst nightmare of my life. It all started on a regular Tuesday. You know those days that seem to never end? Piled up work, a boss breathing down your neck, problems popping up out of nowhere. That was exactly it. My name is Ethan, and that night, all I wanted was one thing: rest. I left the office quite late. Almost 10 p.m. Traffic was a nightmare, of course. When I finally got home, all I could do was drop my things on the floor and collapse onto the bed. I didn't even have the energy to eat, shower, nothing. I just needed to sleep, to shut off, to forget the world. And I slept. For a few hours, at least. But around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. It was as if something had yanked me back into consciousness, but in a wrong way. When I opened my eyes, I felt a wave of dread wash over me without even understanding why. The first thing I noticed was the silence. A strange, heavy silence, almost suffocating. There wasn't a single sound. No wind outside. No hum from the fan I always leave on. It was as if the world had paused. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body was completely locked, as if someone had tied me to the bed. The only thing I could move was my eyes, which darted around frantically, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then I realized I wasn't alone. The room looked the same as always, but there was a presence. Something was there. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel it. A pressure in the air, almost as if someone was watching me, just waiting for me to notice its existence. My heart started racing. The fear began to grow inside me, an irrational sensation, but at the same time, impossible to ignore. That thing was there, somewhere, and I was vulnerable, unable to react. I made a tremendous effort to try to move a finger, anything, but it was useless. My body wouldn't respond. The only thing I could do was look, and what I saw in that moment almost made my heart stop. In the corner of the room, near the door, a shadow started to form. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the shadow moved. It was tall, thin, and seemed to be floating. It had no face, just a distorted silhouette that seemed to blend with the darkness of the room. I tried to scream, but my voice was also trapped. Only the panic inside me grew. The shadow was slowly approaching, as if it wanted to prolong my anguish. My eyes teared up from the effort of trying to break free, but nothing happened. It was close now, so close that I could feel the air grow heavier with each passing second. And then, it stopped right next to my bed. I could feel its invisible weight on me, even without seeing it directly. The shadow had no eyes, but it felt like it was staring at me, studying every detail of my panic, feeding off it. The fear I felt was visceral, something I had never experienced before, not even in my worst nightmares. Then, something even more horrifying happened. I felt a touch on my arm. It wasn't physical. It was as if the shadow was brushing something cold and icy across my skin. My mind was exploding with terror. I knew this wasn't normal. It wasn't a dream. But what was it then? The presence began to whisper something. Words I couldn't understand, but that sounded like a distant murmur, like muffled voices in a long, dark hallway. The touch moved up to my neck, and for a moment, I thought it was going to strangle me. Suddenly, everything stopped. The shadow retreated, slowly moving away. My legs and arms were still motionless, but I managed to move my fingers a little. That was enough to break the trance, and with an almost superhuman effort, I managed to move my arm. In the blink of an eye, the shadow disappeared. The heavy silence lingered for a few more seconds until I could let out a low groan, feeling my body finally start to respond. Little by little, I was drenched in cold sweat, my heart racing, and with the sensation that something much deeper had just happened. Something that wasn't just a typical sleep paralysis. The question that kept hammering in my mind as I tried to recover was that real? When the alarm went off the next day, I could hardly believe I had slept at all. I got out of bed like I had been beaten up, my body sore, and my mind foggy. That day, everything felt out of place, as if I was somehow disconnected from reality. At work, I could barely concentrate. But as nightfall came, the fear returned with force. What if it happened again? Anxiety took over me as the night approached. I tried everything to avoid going home. I stayed late at work, coming up with excuses to not leave. When I finally got in the car, driving through the quiet streets of the city, I felt a chill down my spine, as if I was being watched again. I didn't want to be alone at home and couldn't go to a friend's house, because all my coworkers had families, and it would be awkward to ask to spend the night with any of them. When I got home, all the lights were off, as usual, but this time the silence felt much more oppressive. Before going in, I stood at the door for a few seconds, trying to gather the courage. The fear of that shadow, of that icy touch, wouldn't leave my mind. Even so, I went in and locked the door, letting the exhaustion drag me back to bed. I lay down, trying to push away the thoughts of what had happened the night before, trying to rationalize. It was just sleep paralysis, I told myself, but the doubt was still there, gnawing at my mind. What if it wasn't? What if it was something beyond what science can explain? Something supernatural? I fell asleep faster than I expected, my body still exhausted from the day before. But deep down, I knew what was going to happen. I woke up in the middle of the night again, exactly at the same time, 3 in the morning, and once again, I was completely paralyzed. Immediate terror gripped me. My eyes opened, and there it was. The shadow. This time, it wasn't in the corner of the room. It was right above me, as if floating over my chest. The pressure was unbearable. I could barely breathe. I tried to move my arms, my legs, but nothing responded. It was as if my body no longer belonged to me. It moved slowly, as if savoring my agony. I felt that presence again, the icy touch spreading across my body. My mind was screaming for help, but my mouth couldn't produce any sound. The despair grew with each passing second, and the shadow continued to hover, as if it was consuming me. This time, though, it was different. It started coming closer, almost close enough to touch its face to mine. I could feel the cold of whatever it was, a cold that seemed to come from inside it, spreading to the deepest parts of my soul. Suddenly, the whisper returned, but this time, I understood. "You can't escape," the voice said, now clear as if it were inside my head. "You are trapped." That was the trigger. My mind started spinning, the panic took over, and I used every ounce of strength I had left to try to move. The shadow came even closer, until I felt what seemed like its touch on my face. It was like plunging into ice, a sensation that made me want to scream, but I was still mute, motionless. Then, in a sudden burst, I managed to move my hand. My arm jerked violently, and in an instant, the shadow disappeared. The silence returned, but now it felt even more disturbing. I was sweating, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to explode. My entire body was drenched in sweat, as if I had run a marathon. I sat up in bed, breathing deeply, trying to convince myself that it was over. That night, I didn't go back to sleep. I stayed awake until dawn, waiting for the sun to come through the window to give me some sort of relief, but the feeling of being watched never went away. In the days that followed, the shadow didn't return, but something changed inside me. The fear of that experience followed me everywhere. No matter what I did, I always felt like that thing was still watching me, waiting for the right time to come back. I researched sleep paralysis, and every article I read tried to explain what happened to me as something normal, but nothing seemed to truly justify what I saw, what I felt. There was no explanation that gave me peace. Since then, the nights have never been the same. I avoid sleeping in the dark, always leaving a light on, as if that would protect me. The fear of waking up paralyzed again, of feeling the shadow hovering over me, still haunts me. And deep down, I know it will come back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but at some point, when I'm most vulnerable, it will appear again. And next time, maybe I won't be able to escape.